Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and also thank you very much to BADIL for inviting me here. I'm very impressed with the speakers I've heard so far, and very impressed also with the range of expertise in the room, in the questions and discussion. I must say I am not a lawyer, I'm a political scientist, and so some of what I'm going to say may be slightly different to how lawyers would analyse this issue, but I think it's a way in which maybe has a wider appeal to a wider audience. I'm going to be looking at the Palestinian claims in international context, and I'm afraid I have both some good news and some bad news. And I'll talk about the good news and the bad news at the end. In the main, there's three forms of reparations, and this is not necessarily the way that it's organised in international law, but this is the way I think covers the issues more clearly. There's this issue of satisfaction, restitution and compensation. And in this study, which is a very illustrative study, it's not a detailed study, I'm just covering, doing a broad overview. I look at about 7 or 8 cases from Bosnia right through to South Africa, and just to kind of give an idea of how has reparations taken place in these places. And some of these case studies are actually very complex, and I don't have the time to go into the detail about them. But for example, in Guatemala, the difference between what is agreed on paper and what actually has taken place in reality is very great, but I don't have time to go into that in a lot of detail. Or in the post-communist Europe examples, there are so many different countries involved. Lumping them all together, it simplifies it, and so I just want you to bear in mind it is a very complex issue, just looking at post-communist Europe reparations. I'm going to look at the 3 cases, but only very briefly look at the satisfaction one, because I think the other 2 are perhaps more interesting for this particular case. So I just want to sort of mention here that satisfaction takes the form of some acknowledgement of the violence, some expression of regret, some formal apology, and often this is manifested and debated through these commissions, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And here you have a picture of people in East Timor discussing these issues. Apologies. But when I turn to the main types of restitution, I think that we can identify 4 main types. There's the restitution in kind. Restitution involves some sort of exchange of land or property or different assets. Restitution which includes some sort of development as assistance to major parties, and the issue of claimant choice. And I'll look at all of those types in a little bit of detail. When we talk about restitution in kind, this in effect means the return to the original property, the repossession of the property, regaining the title of the property that was lost. It's usually part of a big peace agreement where this is permitted, and there are some issues around whether the property has been improved or changed in some way, which then is also needs to be adjusted in terms of how the restitution takes place. So this is the kind of the ideal type for most refugee situations. However, there are a lot of problems with restitution in kind. Mostly it's the limits set by the degree of secondary occupation. How many people have moved into the property, how long they've been there. And in most cases that I've studied, the rights of the current occupants are protected in some way. People who have moved in to refugee property do eventually accumulate some rights. It becomes very burdensome, legally very difficult to evict them. They have to be provided with alternative accommodation, they have some claims, they have some compensation. It becomes very expensive. And in a period of post-conflict where the situation is still very fragile, it can be destabilising. And in some cases, the property itself has been demolished, and so the rebuilding of that the destroyed property is, again, a complex matter. In looking at the case studies that I mentioned to you, you can see there's sort of two kinds, really. There's some restitution programs which prioritise restitution. And in the case of Bosnia, Kosovo, and Iraq, which is the reversing the Arabization of some of the properties period, not the UNCC program that took place after 2000, after the first Gulf War. It's the reversing of the Ba'ath Party Arabization proposals. In some of those examples, prioritising restitution was very important. In other cases, there was an attempt to limit restitution because it would either destabilise the situation or it would change the ethnic mix of an agreement which was part of the overall settlement between the two parties. And this is the Rwanda, Cyprus, or in South Africa. The second kind of restitution is when properties, there's an exchange not just of property but of other assets. And you may get another kind of property apart from the one that you used to own. Or you may get other kinds of assets, other kinds of advantages instead of the property, such as assistance with repatriation, a package including tools, money, cash, skills, vouchers, something like this. Or there may be a possibility of some other land is expropriated from the place that you're going to offer the property because the original property is too difficult to be returned in kind. And again, if you look at some of the case studies in Cyprus, people who are secondary occupants themselves, in the south, so some of the Greek Cypriots have moved into Turkish Cypriot properties, they can do an exchange. They may not get the exact property back that they wanted, but they can exchange their property for a property in the north. Or they may be given some bonds, some sort of investment, a part of an investment fund which has interest accruing, which will allow them to buy a different kind of property in the future. In Guatemala, there was examples where people were given cheap loans to allow them to buy land instead of going back to the original land that they owned. And in post-communist Europe, there are many examples where people did not return to their original properties, but were given land nearby, which was sometimes suited them better because the original property had become very urbanised and they were of farming stock and they wanted to have land nearby rather than the urban property.